It started with a frantic call on a quiet afternoon, one that would pull an entire community into a nightmare they could never have imagined. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7 to 21. We've got a possible DOA. Send backup." The officer's voice cracked slightly over the radio, but the message was clear. Something inside that small blue house on the edge of Brookhaven Drive wasn't right. When officers pushed open the front door, the smell hit them first. Sharp, chemical, and wrong. A man's voice called out, "Sir, police department, announce yourself." But no answer came. What they found inside would change everything they thought they knew about one of their own. At first glance, the scene looked like a simple tragedy. A quiet, elderly woman sitting motionless in a recliner, television still flickering faintly in the dim living room. But as the lead investigator, Sergeant Mark Rivera, stepped closer, he saw what others missed. The woman's hand was clenched unnaturally tight around a piece of torn fabric. Her neck showed faint bruising that didn't match the story the room was trying to tell. Rivera whispered, almost to himself. This wasn't natural. Behind him, a younger officer shifted nervously. "You think this was staged?" Rivera didn't answer right away. He scanned the small house. Tidy, peaceful, almost too peaceful, and then nodded slowly. "Yeah, someone wanted us to think it was." That moment marked the beginning of one of the most chilling investigations in the town's history, and the unraveling of a secret buried deeper than anyone imagined. The victim was identified as Eleanor Grayson, a 62-year-old retired librarian known for her warmth and reliability. She had lived alone since her husband passed away years earlier, and her small home was a place of comfort for her son, John Grayson, a 72-year-old retired police sergeant from the neighboring county. John had served nearly 4 decades in law enforcement, known among his peers for his calm leadership and meticulous attention to detail. He'd solved some of the town's toughest cases, but nothing could prepare him for becoming the center of one himself. It began 2 days earlier when Eleanor's neighbor, Marie Holden, called 911 after noticing something unusual. "She hasn't come out to water her plants. Not once in 2 days," she told dispatch, her voice trembling. "Her car's still there, lights on inside since last night." When police arrived, the door was unlocked. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the television. It looked like Eleanor had simply fallen asleep, but one look from the medical examiner changed that assumption instantly. "She didn't die sitting there," the examiner said. "Someone moved her." From that point on, the story of a quiet life and a peaceful death began to crack apart. The investigation quickly turned up strange details. In the kitchen, 2 coffee mugs sat half empty on the counter, one with lipstick, one without. Next to them, an untouched plate of cookies wrapped neatly in foil. Whoever had been there last had shared coffee with Eleanor, then left without cleaning up. Detectives dusted the cups for prints. Only one matched Eleanor's. The other, partial, smudged, remained unidentified. The team began tracing her last known movements. Her phone showed no calls or messages after 2:17 p.m. on Saturday, when she'd texted her son John, "Stop by later if you can. I baked your favorite." But John told police he never saw that message. He said he'd been at home all weekend, resting after a recent surgery. "Mom and I talked Friday night," he told them, his voice even but distant. "She said she was fine. I planned to visit Sunday." Detectives noted the hesitation in his voice but moved on. After all, John Grayson was a respected former officer. Nobody wanted to believe he could be involved in anything sinister. The following morning, a pathologist found something that would shift the entire direction of the case. The bruising on Eleanor's neck was faint but unmistakable, caused by fingers pressing hard against the skin. Her cause of death: asphyxiation. But there was more. Small fibers under her fingernails matched the torn piece of fabric clutched in her hand, a dark navy blue material, like that from a uniform or jacket. Sergeant Rivera reviewed the evidence photos late that night. The fibers, the bruising, the missing prints, all of it told him one thing. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. This wasn't random. It was personal. When he asked the coroner for a timeline of death, the answer came back unsettlingly precise. Between 3 o'clock and 3:30 p.m., the same time Eleanor's smartwatch had stopped recording her heart rate. Rivera stared at the report, his jaw tightening. "Who visits their mother at 3 p.m. on a Saturday?" he muttered. The answer, as everyone in the department already knew, was John Grayson. The next step was routine: interview the family. But for Rivera, questioning a man who'd worn the same badge for nearly 40 years felt anything but routine. John answered the door with a calm smile. He still carried the posture of an officer, upright, disciplined, respectful. "Mark Rivera," he greeted, shaking the younger man's hand. "I heard about my mother. God, it's been hard to believe." Rivera nodded, studying him quietly. The old cop's eyes didn't look teary or red, just distant. Controlled. Too controlled. "Mr. Grayson, I know this is difficult," Rivera said, "but we need to go over your whereabouts Saturday afternoon." John leaned against the doorframe, thoughtful. "Saturday. I was home. Watching the game. My neighbor can vouch. Saw me taking the trash out around 2:45. Rivera jotted a note. "And Sunday morning?" "I called Mom. No answer. Figured she went out early for groceries. She liked doing that before the crowds." The conversation lasted nearly an hour. Rivera left with little more than polite answers and a lingering unease. He'd met plenty of grieving relatives before, but grief had texture. It came out raw, unpredictable. John's felt rehearsed. Days passed with no new leads, but then a small piece of technology changed everything. During a deeper sweep of Eleanor's home, detectives found a smart home hub plugged into her living room wall, one of those devices that recorded snippets of conversations when activated. The tech team pulled the data, hoping for background noise or accidental audio. What they found made the hairs on Rivera's neck stand up. A recording from 3:17 p.m. Saturday. Eleanor's voice. "John, don't do this. Please." Then a crash. Muffled movement. Silence. The clip ended abruptly. The room went quiet as the tech replayed the clip. Rivera stood still, jaw tightening. "That's all of it?" The technician nodded. "That's all the device saved before it shut off." It wasn't proof beyond doubt, but it was the crack they needed. Early the next morning, Rivera and his team executed a search warrant at John's home. The house was neat, almost obsessively so. The living room walls were lined with old police memorabilia, commendation plaques, photos of John with fellow officers, a framed retirement certificate. But in the back of his laundry room, detectives found a plastic bag tucked behind a box of cleaning supplies. Inside, a navy blue jacket with small red stains along the cuff. When tested, those stains matched Eleanor's blood type. John sat at his kitchen table as Rivera presented the evidence. "I don't understand," he said softly. "I haven't worn that jacket in months." Rivera's eyes stayed locked on him. "It was found freshly laundered, Mr. Grayson, but not clean enough." The silence between them stretched long enough to make the ticking clock on the wall sound deafening. Despite mounting evidence, Rivera still couldn't shake one question. Why would a father do this to his own mother? The autopsy had shown no signs of struggle beyond the strangulation marks. The kitchen showed no forced entry. No valuables were missing. But when investigators checked Eleanor's bank records, a disturbing pattern appeared. Large withdrawals, thousands of dollars, made over several months. Each withdrawal came just days before transfers into John's account. It wasn't hard to connect the dots. When questioned, John said his mother had helped him with bills. But further investigation revealed he'd recently been denied a second mortgage, and his retirement savings were almost gone. Rivera leaned back in his chair after reading the report. He was drowning, he said quietly. And she was his lifeline. 2 weeks into the investigation, Rivera met with the district attorney to discuss next steps. The DA wanted solid digital evidence before moving forward. That came sooner than expected. Eleanor's smartwatch company finally released her activity logs. The data confirmed her heart rate spiked violently at 3:18 p.m., exactly when the home device captured the confrontation, then flatlined 2 minutes later. Forensic data, digital proof, and blood evidence, it all pointed in one direction. Rivera knew what had to happen next. The following morning, he and 2 officers pulled into John Grayson's driveway. The air was cold, the sky overcast. When John opened the door, Rivera kept his tone calm. "John Grayson, we have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the death of Eleanor Grayson." For a split second, the retired officer's composure cracked. His eyes widened, then hardened. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. Rivera's voice stayed steady. "I hope I am." They cuffed him gently, as one might an old colleague. The sound of metal clicking shut echoed through the neighborhood like a final sentence. As they guided him to the patrol car, John glanced back at his house, at the framed photo of him and his mother visible through the window, and whispered, "I was only trying to help her." If you've been following this investigation, make sure you're subscribed to Cops Crime Series. The stories we uncover here reveal just how far people can go to hide the truth. What comes next will expose a side of this case no one, not even the detectives, saw coming. That was just the beginning. Because what police would soon find hidden inside John Grayson's home office, behind a false wall he'd built himself, would uncover not only how his mother died, but the horrifying truth of why. The air inside the Grayson residence was still thick with disbelief as detectives began their second, more thorough search. The house had the feel of someone who lived in memories rather than the present. Framed photos of old colleagues, medals from decades of service, even his police badge encased in glass. Everything was ordered, polished, frozen in time. But behind that perfect order, they could sense something darker. It was Officer Kevin Alvarez who noticed it first. A faint line along the wall of John's home office, the kind that didn't quite match the rest of the paneling. "Hey, Sarge," he called softly. "You might want to see this." Rivera crouched beside him, tracing the seam with his flashlight. The gap was subtle, almost invisible unless you were looking directly at it. "Looks like a false wall," he muttered. "He built this himself, using a pry tool." Alvarez eased the edge open. The panel popped free with a low creak, revealing a small hidden compartment no bigger than a closet. Inside were boxes, neatly stacked, labeled in John's handwriting. But it wasn't the boxes that drew Rivera's attention. It was what lay on the desk behind them, a small locked wooden chest with the initials EG carved into the lid. Rivera frowned. "Eleanor Grayson," he whispered. The chest was secured with an old brass padlock. When they forced it open, what they found inside stunned them all. Bundles of cash, tens of thousands of dollars, old case files, some marked confidential, a series of photographs of Eleanor, all recent, but taken from outside her house. They weren't the kind of photos a loving son would take. They were surveillance shots, distance angles, time-stamped, logged. Rivera felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't just visiting her, he said quietly. He was watching her. When confronted with the discovery, John Grayson remained calm, too calm. Sitting in the interrogation room, hands folded neatly in front of him, he looked more like a man waiting for a staff meeting than someone accused of killing his own mother. Rivera entered, closing the door behind him. The fluorescent light above buzzed faintly. "John," he began, "we found your hidden office compartment. You want to tell me why there were surveillance photos of your mother in there?" John didn't look up. "I kept an eye on her. She was old, forgetful. Sometimes she'd leave the stove on. I just wanted to make sure she was safe." Rivera leaned forward. "You kept files, logs. You tracked every movement she made for months. That's not protection. That's obsession." For the first time, John's composure wavered. "You don't understand," he snapped, then caught himself, lowering his voice. She wasn't herself anymore. She was slipping. Rivera tilted his head. "Slipping how?" John's eyes darted to the table. "She was giving things away. Money, jewelry. She didn't trust me anymore. She thought I was using her." He gave a hollow laugh. "After everything I did for her." Rivera let the silence stretch. "So you watched her. You tracked her. And when she confronted you, things got out of hand?" John shook his head slowly. "I didn't kill her," he said softly. "But I should have stopped what happened." That line, "I should have stopped what happened," stuck with Rivera long after he left the room. What did he mean? The next day, detectives dug deeper into the files they'd found in John's hidden compartment. Most were copies of old police reports from the 1980s and 1990s, years when John had worked homicide. But one folder, marked only with the letter S, contained something chilling. Autopsy photos of a woman who looked eerily like Eleanor in her younger years. At first, Rivera assumed it was part of an old case file. But when he checked the name on the report, his stomach dropped. Sarah Grayson, John's late wife. She had died 30 years ago in what had been ruled a tragic accident, a fall down the stairs. John was the reporting officer. Rivera brought the file to his captain, who scanned it quickly. "You're telling me this man might have killed his wife too?" "I'm saying," Rivera replied carefully, "the similarities are too much to ignore. Same bruising pattern. Same attempt to stage it as accidental. And the kicker? The pathologist on both cases was the same man, retired last year." The captain leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Get him in here. Today." When they located the retired pathologist, Dr. Henry Collins, he was reluctant to speak at first. "That was decades ago," he said, shaking his head. "But I remember Sarah Grayson, pretty woman. That case always felt off to me." Rivera pressed gently. "Off how?" Collins hesitated, then sighed. "John was the one who found her. Said she tripped on the stairs after drinking. But the bruises, They didn't look like a fall. They looked like hands. Rivera's expression hardened. "You didn't report that?" "I did," Collins said quietly. "But John was a cop." The department closed ranks. "They told me to leave it." The realization hit Rivera like a blow. This wasn't a single tragic incident. It was a pattern, and it had been hiding in plain sight for decades. While investigators re-examined Sarah's old death records, Rivera returned to the Grayson house. He wanted to understand what kind of man could carry such darkness for so long. The neighbors painted a complicated picture. John was polite, but private. He kept to himself, spent most of his days working in his garden or tinkering in his garage. "He was the perfect gentleman," one neighbor said. "Brought us cookies at Christmas. Never would have guessed he had anything to hide." But another neighbor, a retired officer who had worked under John years ago, told a different story. "He was good at his job," the man said, "but cold. Never talked about feelings, never took criticism. You cross him once, he never forgot." Rivera began piecing together the mosaic of a man raised in discipline and secrecy, a man who learned early that control was everything. As detectives waited for forensic results on the jacket, another piece of evidence surfaced, one that deepened the mystery even further. Technicians found a secondary hard drive in the hidden compartment, encrypted but recoverable. Once decoded, it contained hundreds of audio files, private recordings John had made over the years. Some were ordinary conversations, phone calls, interviews from his police days, but others were deeply unsettling. One recording stood out, dated September 8th, the day Eleanor died. John's voice was calm, steady, almost gentle. "Mom, I can't keep doing this. You've got to stop giving away money." Eleanor's voice trembled. "It's my money, John. You can't control everything." Then a pause. "Please," John said quietly. "Don't make me do something I'll regret." The recording ended with a dull thud, something hitting the floor, and then silence. Rivera sat listening in the dim evidence room, the glow of the computer screen painting shadows across his face. "He recorded it," he whispered. "He recorded everything." But there was still one hole in the case: motive. Why now? Why kill his mother after so many years of peaceful coexistence? The answer came from an unexpected source: Eleanor's lawyer. When detectives contacted the law firm managing her estate, they learned Eleanor had made a recent change to her will, 2 weeks before her death. In the new version, she had removed John as the primary beneficiary, leaving her property to a local foundation that supported widows of fallen officers. When Rivera read the statement, everything clicked. He called the DA immediately. "She found out what he did to his wife," he said flatly, "and she was going to expose him." The following morning, Rivera sat across from John once more. "Your mother changed her will," Rivera said quietly. "Cut you out completely." "Did she tell you that?" John's face remained expressionless. "She mentioned something. Said she wanted to do some good before she went." Rivera slid the recording transcript across the table. "This is you, threatening her. And we found your wife's file in your house, the one you covered up 30 years ago." For a long moment, John said nothing. Then he exhaled slowly. "I never meant for it to go that far." Rivera waited. "She was going to tell people," John whispered. "After Sarah died, I swore no one would ever know. I built a life, a career. I protected this town. But she wouldn't stop." His voice broke, just once, before he straightened again. "You don't understand what it's like to lose control after holding it for so long." Rivera's voice was calm. "You're right. I don't. But I understand consequences." Later that night, Rivera sat in his car outside the station, the confession replaying in his head. There was something haunting about John's tone. Not rage, not remorse, but exhaustion. Like a man who'd finally reached the end of a long lie. He looked out at the rain-slicked streets of Brookhaven, the quiet houses glowing softly in the mist. Somewhere, he thought, another family was laughing, another son calling his mother. And here, a man who'd spent his life chasing justice had destroyed it in his own home. The irony wasn't lost on him. If you're watching this, make sure you're subscribed to Cops Crime Series. The deeper investigators went into this case, the more disturbing secrets they uncovered. Not just about John Grayson, but about what his department may have helped him hide. Because the real shock wasn't what John confessed to. It was what the police archives revealed about how many times he'd done it before. The deeper investigators dug into John Grayson's past, the clearer it became that his mother's death wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was the final act in a long and disturbing pattern that had spanned decades. At first, the records seemed ordinary. Routine case files from his years in homicide, thousands of pages covering every imaginable crime. But Rivera noticed something chilling. Across 30 years of service, several of John's old cases had eerie similarities. Same method of injury, same staging, same kind of victims. All women. All found in domestic settings. All ruled accidental or self-inflicted. Rivera leaned over the case files late one night in the evidence room, fluorescent lights flickering overhead. "How many of these did he close?" he muttered. Alvarez, flipping through another stack, looked grim. "Too many." Each file told the same story. A woman dead, a scene that looked clean, a lack of evidence, and John Grayson listed as lead investigator. The realization hit them both hard. John hadn't just crossed the line once. He'd learned how to bury the truth and had been perfecting it his entire career. The district attorney authorized a full review of every case John had handled in his last 15 years on the force. Rivera and his team set up a temporary command post inside the old records division. Boxes were stacked to the ceiling, each labeled with a year and case number. One folder from 1998 caught Rivera's attention. The victim, Catherine Lowe, age 34. Cause of death, blunt force trauma. Ruled, accidental fall. But the autopsy photos showed the same marks found on Eleanor and Sarah. Bruising around the neck, uneven pressure patterns. Same fingerprints of control, Rivera whispered. When they cross-checked the crime scene report, they found a note buried deep in the file. A complaint from a neighbor who claimed she'd seen a tall man in a brown jacket leaving the scene hours before police were called. The witness's name had been crossed out. When Alvarez ran the signature, the handwriting matched John's. Back at the precinct, Rivera pinned a map of Brookhaven County to the wall. Red markers bloomed across it, each one representing a case tied to Grayson. The cluster formed a pattern that chilled everyone in the room. He'd stayed close to home. Most of his cases had taken place within a 20-mile radius of his own address, hidden in plain sight, disguised as good police work. How does something like this go unnoticed for so long? Alvarez asked quietly. Rivera didn't look up, because he was the one writing the reports. Meanwhile, the news of John's arrest sent shockwaves through the department. Retired officers called in disbelief. Old partners questioned their own memories. Could the man they once trusted to train them have been living a double life all along? The department issued a brief statement. The Brookhaven Police Department is cooperating fully with investigators. We are reviewing past cases linked to retired Sergeant John Grayson. Our priority remains transparency and justice for all victims. But inside the force, morale crumbled. Younger officers avoided the topic. Older ones couldn't stop talking about it. One retired lieutenant who had supervised John in the early 1990s told Rivera something that made his blood run cold. Back then, we thought John was the best we had. He never lost his cool, never showed emotion. But there was this one time, a domestic call. The suspect was an abusive husband. When we got there, John snapped, put the guy through a wall. I'd never seen him like that. Rivera asked, "What happened after?" The lieutenant shrugged. Internal affairs looked into it, but nothing came of it. The guy dropped charges, moved out of town. Or was made to, Rivera murmured. As media coverage intensified, Rivera's team stayed focused. They now had evidence of 3 potential victims linked directly to John Grayson. But the prosecutors needed proof, not just theory. Forensic specialists revisited archived evidence from Sarah's case. Decades-old samples were degraded, but one small fragment, a fingernail clipping, still contained trace DNA. It wasn't a perfect match, but consistent with John's profile. It was enough to reopen the case officially. When Rivera informed John's public defender, the man sighed heavily. He's not denying involvement, but he's not confessing either. Says he'll explain it in his own time. Rivera knew what that meant. He'd seen it before. Old cops who couldn't let go of the idea that they were still in control. A week later, Rivera received an envelope with no return address. Inside was an old cassette tape labeled simply, "For Rivera," from the truth he missed. He stared at it for a long moment, heart pounding. The writing looked familiar, the same careful cursive from John's files. When the audio text played it, static filled the room, then John's calm, low voice. "You're looking in the wrong direction, Rivera. You think this is about murder. It's not. It's about loyalty. The system made me this way. They needed someone to clean the messes no one else would touch." There was a pause, then a sound like a match striking. "You think justice is clean? Try wearing a badge for 40 years. You start seeing what you're willing to hide for the greater good." The recording ended abruptly. Rivera sat back, his mind spinning. Was this a confession? A taunt? Or something more sinister? A final attempt to rewrite his own legacy? The DA ordered the team to cross-reference John's service history. What they found added yet another layer of complexity. Throughout his career, John had been assigned repeatedly to cases involving fellow officers, mostly domestic disputes, misconduct, or accidental deaths. Many of those cases had vanished from the public record after internal resolution. It seemed John's role wasn't just to solve crimes. He was the department's fixer. Whenever a cop's family got caught up in scandal, John was sent to make it disappear. Cover one secret, Rivera said bitterly, and it teaches you how to cover them all. As investigators built their case, Rivera couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something missing, something deeper behind John's obsession with control. He visited John again at the county detention center. The old man looked frailer now, his once steady hands trembling slightly, yet his eyes were still sharp, calculating. Rivera sat across from him. You were the department's fixer. That's how this started, wasn't it? You learned to bury the truth for others until you couldn't tell where their sins ended and yours began. John's lips curled into the faintest smile. You sound just like I did once. Why them, John? Why your wife, your mother? Rivera pressed. John leaned back. Because they were the only ones I couldn't control, he said quietly. And control is the only thing that ever kept me alive. The words hung heavy in the air. Rivera stood slowly. Then maybe losing it is justice. Outside, the rain had started again, streaking down the glass walls of the precinct. Rivera watched as reporters crowded the steps, microphones raised like weapons. The story had gone national now, retired officer accused in decades of hidden killings. It was the kind of story that could break trust in an entire department. But Rivera refused to let it end in shadows. He assembled a press conference the next morning. Cameras flashed as he stepped to the podium. For too long, he said firmly, truth was treated like a burden instead of a duty. This investigation shows what happens when silence becomes protection. No one, not even those sworn to uphold the law, is above it. Behind him, photos of the victims appeared. Sarah Grayson, Catherine Lowe, Eleanor Grayson, each one connected by the same quiet man who once wore the same badge Rivera now carried. After the conference, Rivera returned to his office. On his desk lay another sealed envelope, this one from the district's cold case division. Inside were files from 2 unsolved deaths in the early 2000s. Both women had been wives of police officers. Both had been ruled accidental, and both cases listed Detective John Grayson as the first responder. Rivera closed his eyes, a knot tightening in his chest. How many, John? He whispered. How many did you fix, and how many did you finish? As weeks passed, more victims surfaced, stories that had been forgotten, families who'd given up on justice years ago. Each revelation painted a clearer picture of who John Grayson truly was, not a monster born overnight, but one shaped by a lifetime of power without accountability. And yet the question lingered. Why leave the tape? Why confess in riddles instead of silence? When forensic analysts examined the cassette casing, they found microscopic fingerprints, not just John's, but a second, unfamiliar set. It belonged to someone who had visited him at the detention center days before the package was mailed. The visitor log revealed a name, Detective Brian Keller, a retired officer who had worked alongside John for more than 20 years. Rivera's stomach turned. He's not working alone, he muttered. Someone's still protecting him. If you've been following this story, don't forget to subscribe to Cops Crime Series. What investigators uncovered next tore open a decades-old conspiracy inside the department, one that went far beyond John Grayson himself. Because as they would soon discover, the father's secret wasn't just personal, it was institutional. The revelation that a retired detective, Brian Keller, had visited John Grayson in custody changed everything. Rivera had seen cover-ups before, but this felt orchestrated. If Keller was involved, then John's crimes might be just one thread in a much larger web, one woven through years of silence and brotherhood. Rivera drove through the heavy rain to Keller's house that evening. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew each other by name. Keller answered the door in a faded department sweatshirt, his gray hair neatly combed back, expression calm. "Evening, detective," he said. "Can I help you?" Rivera held up his badge. "We need to talk about John Grayson." For a moment, Keller's eyes flickered, just a flash of recognition before the calm returned. "John? Haven't spoken to him in years." Rivera didn't buy it. "That's interesting," he said evenly. Because the visitor logs say otherwise. Keller hesitated, then sighed. Come in. Inside, the house was filled with reminders of the past. Framed photos of Keller and Grayson in uniform, awards, plaques, commendations. It looked less like a home and more like a shrine to a career. Rivera glanced around. You kept a lot from those days. Memories, Keller said. Nothing more. They sat at the kitchen table. Rivera kept his tone measured. You visited Grayson after his arrest. Why? Keller poured coffee into 2 mugs, his hands steady. I wanted to hear his side. You know how the press twists things. Rivera leaned forward. He sent me a tape. Said he was covering up for others. Was he talking about you? Keller's jaw tightened. John was a good cop, maybe too good. He did what needed to be done when the rest of us looked away. Cover-ups? Rivera pressed. Call them what you want. Sometimes justice and truth don't line up. You spend enough years in this job. You start to see that the system doesn't fix everything. John believed he was cleaning up the mess no one else wanted to touch. Rivera's voice hardened. And how many people died for that belief? Keller didn't answer. Back at the precinct, Rivera's team began cross-referencing Keller's old case records with Grayson's. The overlap was staggering. The 2 men had worked side by side on at least 10 suspicious deaths involving police families. Every one of them had been declared accidental or closed due to lack of evidence. Alvarez shook his head in disbelief. It's like they built an entire wall of silence. Rivera nodded grimly, and they hid behind the badge. The next day, Rivera requested a search warrant for Keller's property. The judge approved it, citing probable cause based on the visitor logs and overlapping casework. When the team arrived, Keller was gone. His car was missing. A bolo was issued immediately, and the search of his home began. What they found inside made even the most seasoned officers uneasy. In the basement was a locked filing cabinet, sealed with rusted chains. Once cut open, it revealed dozens of old tapes, VHS and cassette, each labeled with names and case numbers. Many of those names matched victims from John Grayson's reopened cases. Rivera picked up one tape, Low C, 1998. Another read Anders, M, 2003. Every case they thought Grayson had handled alone. Keller had a record of it. The implication was clear. He hadn't just known about John's crimes. He'd been documenting them. As tech analysts worked to digitize the tapes, Rivera stood silently, watching grainy footage flicker onto the screen. One tape showed a dimly lit living room, the aftermath of a crime scene. John Grayson stood in frame, gloved hands moving with eerie calm as he rearranged objects around a body. Off camera, Keller's voice spoke. Make it look like she fell here. Move the table closer. John didn't hesitate. Got it. Another tape showed them loading bags into an unmarked car, laughing quietly as sirens wailed in the distance. Alvarez whispered, They filmed themselves. Rivera's jaw clenched. No, they documented everything. Like trophies. Meanwhile, news of Keller's disappearance hit the airwaves. Reporters swarmed the precinct, demanding answers. The department's credibility hung by a thread. At a press conference, Rivera stood before the cameras once more. We are now investigating evidence that suggests a long-term conspiracy within the Brookhaven Police Department, involving at least 2 former detectives. We are following every lead. This department will not protect its own at the expense of truth. Behind the calm words, Rivera felt the weight of every lost life pressing down. 2 days later, Keller's car was found abandoned at an overlook on the outskirts of town. Inside, officers discovered a folded note on the passenger seat. The truth was never meant to survive. There was no sign of Keller himself. A search of the surrounding woods began immediately. Helicopters circled overhead. Officers combed through dense brush and rocky terrain. But as night fell, the hunt yielded nothing. It was as if Keller had vanished into the rain. Rivera couldn't help but feel that this wasn't an escape. It was closure, in his own twisted way. The forensic analysis of the tapes revealed even more horrifying details. The recordings spanned nearly 20 years, and not all of them showed crime scenes. Some were personal. Candid moments of John and Keller talking about corrections they'd made, loose ends they'd tied up. In one recording from 2007, Keller's voice said, she was going to talk to internal affairs. We couldn't let that happen. John replied simply, then it's handled. Rivera turned away from the playback monitor. God, he muttered. They thought they were saviors. As investigators pieced the story together, a chilling narrative emerged. During their years in homicide, John and Keller had taken it upon themselves to clean up cases they believed the justice system had failed. Abusive spouses, corrupt officers, violent offenders who walked free. At first, maybe they'd seen themselves as avengers. But somewhere along the line, that moral boundary dissolved. They began deciding who deserved to live and who didn't. By the time John retired, the line between protector and predator had vanished completely. Rivera faced a moral dilemma of his own: expose everything and destroy what little public faith remained, or release the truth in stages to protect ongoing investigations. He chose the former. A full report was leaked to the press. Every tape, every file, every covered-up case. The headlines were explosive. Cops turned killers, the hidden justice ring inside Brookhaven PD. Former detectives exposed in decades-long vigilante murders. The community erupted in outrage. Families of long-forgotten victims came forward, demanding answers, demanding accountability. Back in custody, John Grayson watched the news from his cell. He said nothing, as the reports detailed every secret he and Keller had buried. But when Rivera visited one last time, John looked almost relieved. "You finally did it," he said quietly. "You pulled the whole thing into the light." Rivera stared at him. "You sound proud." "I'm tired," John replied. "You ever keep a secret so long you forget it started as a lie?" Rivera didn't respond. He turned to leave, but John called after him. "You still don't get it, do you? It's never just two men. It's a culture. Someone had to teach us how." That line haunted Rivera for weeks. Someone had to teach us. It implied a mentor, someone even higher up, someone still alive. The thought gnawed at him, until one evening he pulled the personnel files for the year John first joined the department. Among the signatures approving his transfer into homicide was one name that kept appearing in every early document: Chief Harold Strickland. Strickland had retired quietly a decade ago, living in a small lakeside town 3 hours north. Rivera made the drive himself. The road wound through fog-covered pines, the kind of silence that amplifies every thought. When he arrived, the former chief was sitting on his porch, a newspaper folded neatly beside him. "I figured this day would come," Strickland said before Rivera could speak. "Sit down, detective." As the two men faced each other, Strickland's expression carried the weight of years. "You trained them," Rivera said evenly. "You built that culture." Strickland nodded slowly. "I built a department that got results. You think the public cared how? They wanted peace, and we gave it to them. Keller and Grayson, they took it too far, but they learned it from me. I taught them that some truths are better buried." Rivera's voice hardened. "And how many people paid for that lesson?" Strickland's eyes met his. "All of them. And all of us." He leaned back, exhaling. "You'll never fix it, Rivera. You'll just replace it." Rivera stood, his voice quiet but firm. "Then I'll start by replacing you." If you've been following this story, stay subscribed to Cops Crime Series. What happens next will expose the final chapter: the downfall of a system built on silence and the shocking fate of the men who thought they were above the law. Because when justice finally came for John Grayson, it didn't arrive in a courtroom. It came from within the walls of his own mind. When Rivera drove back from the lakeside that evening, the sun was setting low behind the trees, a burning orange fading into gray. The road seemed endless, winding through miles of silence. Strickland's words replayed in his mind like a confession carved into stone. "You'll never fix it, Rivera. You'll just replace it." He knew there was truth in it, but he also knew there had to be a line somewhere. Someone had to draw it. By the time he reached Brookhaven, night had fallen. A storm was rolling in, lightning flashing faintly over the hills. Rivera parked outside the precinct and sat for a moment, watching raindrops streak across the windshield. Inside those walls, officers were still sifting through decades of buried cases. Each one told the same story: power left unchecked, justice twisted into something unrecognizable. But one story still wasn't over. John Grayson. In the county jail, John's behavior had begun to change. Guards reported that he spent hours pacing in his cell, muttering under his breath. He refused meals, refused sleep, and when he did speak, it was to no one in particular. "Did you ever notice," he whispered once to a guard, "that silence has a sound?" The guard later said it gave him chills. Psychologists evaluated him for competency to stand trial. Their reports described a man caught between guilt and delusion, a man haunted by ghosts he could no longer silence. Rivera watched from the observation room as John sat across from the department's therapist, Dr. Leland. "Do you believe you did the right thing?" she asked softly. John smiled faintly. Right and wrong stopped mattering a long time ago. I only did what was necessary, even when it meant killing? He looked up then, eyes hollow. Killing? He shook his head slowly. No. Cleaning. Leland's hand trembled slightly as she made a note. Cleaning what, John? The mess, he said simply. The mess everyone left behind. Over the next few weeks, Rivera became obsessed with understanding him, not as a killer, but as a symptom. How does a man who dedicates his life to law and order turn it into his weapon? He visited John one final time, sitting across from him in the gray interview room. John looked thinner now, almost ghostly. His voice was barely above a whisper. You saw Strickland, he said. Did he tell you the truth? He told me enough, Rivera replied. John chuckled faintly. Enough to know he made us, but not enough to understand why we followed. Rivera leaned forward. Then tell me why. John's gaze drifted past him, as though he were seeing something far away. Because the world stopped believing in justice. We didn't kill for pleasure. We killed for balance. And when you do it long enough, balance becomes God. Rivera's jaw tightened. And your mother? Was she balanced too? John's expression shifted. Pain flickered across his face, the first true emotion Rivera had ever seen in him. She found out, he whispered. She read my journals. She said she'd go to the police. I begged her not to. She said I was sick. He swallowed hard. Maybe I was. Rivera said nothing. There was nothing left to say. That night, John Grayson hung himself in his cell. He left no note, no explanation. Just a Bible open to the book of Job and one line underlined in red ink. The thing which I greatly feared has come upon me. When Rivera arrived at the jail, the paramedics were already there. The sound of Velcro gloves and muted voices filled the corridor. Through the small glass window, he saw John's body, pale and still. The same hands that had once sworn to protect had ended their own story in silence. Rivera turned away, the weight of the moment pressing deep into his chest. It wasn't victory. It wasn't justice. It was something colder, closure without peace. After John's death, the department formed a task force to review every case tied to him and Keller. More than a dozen deaths were reclassified as homicides. Families who had waited years for answers finally learned the truth, though it came at a painful cost. The Brookhaven Police Department underwent a massive restructuring. Internal affairs officers were replaced, leadership overhauled, training programs rewritten. But Rivera knew change on paper didn't erase the past. He'd seen what silence could build. In one of the old storage rooms, he found the last remaining box of evidence, John's hidden journals. Inside, hundreds of handwritten pages filled with his meticulous thoughts. Each entry was a reflection of the same obsession: control, order, redemption. The final page stopped Rivera cold. It read, "We weren't heroes. We were custodians, cleaning the dirt no one else wanted to touch. But we forgot that when you clean with blood, you only make more of it." Months passed, and the story of John Grayson faded from national headlines. But for Brookhaven, it never truly went away. The old house on Maple Grove, where Eleanor had died, was eventually sold. New owners moved in, unaware of the history buried beneath the fresh paint and quiet rooms. Rivera drove past it sometimes, watching from the street. He thought of Eleanor's final moments, of Sarah, of all the lives touched by one man's misguided belief in righteousness. Some nights, he dreamed of them. Other nights, he dreamed of John, not as the killer, but as the officer he once was. The man standing in the rain, badge gleaming under a streetlight, promising to protect and serve. Maybe that was the tragedy of it all, that once he truly believed he was saving people. 6 months later, the DA's office held a memorial for the victims. Rivera stood at the back of the hall as names were read aloud. When Eleanor Grayson's name echoed through the speakers, he felt a knot in his throat. After the ceremony, Dr. Leland approached him quietly. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "if he could have been saved?" Rivera shook his head. He didn't want saving. He wanted control. She sighed. Control's just another kind of prison. Rivera glanced toward the memorial wall, where dozens of photos shimmered under soft candlelight. "Yeah," he said quietly, "but some people decorate the cell and call it home." Weeks later, Rivera was promoted to lieutenant. He accepted without celebration. The department was rebuilding, but the shadow of John Grayson lingered like a scar, a reminder that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a badge. Reporters still called occasionally, hoping for a quote, a statement, a soundbite. Rivera always gave the same answer. Justice isn't about finding monsters. It's about preventing men from becoming them. It became the line that defined his career. Late one night, long after most of the city had gone to sleep, Rivera sat alone in his office. The rain tapped softly against the windows. On his desk lay a single photo: John, young and smiling, standing beside his mother on her porch. For a moment, Rivera saw not the killer, but the son, the protector, the man who once believed in the badge. Then he turned the photo over, slid it into an envelope marked Archive, and placed it on the shelf. Some stories, he knew, never truly end. They just wait for the next chapter to be written. If this story left you speechless, make sure you're subscribed to Cops Crime Series, where we uncover the darkest truths behind the men and women sworn to uphold the law. Stories like John Grayson's remind us that corruption isn't born overnight. It grows in silence, in loyalty, in secrets left unspoken. What would you have done if you discovered a loved one hiding a past like his? Let us know your thoughts below. And don't forget to like, share, and turn on notifications so you never miss another case. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, sometimes the most dangerous criminals wear the same uniform as the heroes we trust.